So we are going to talk about the oldest and best manuscripts, but not the ones that you usually think of. This is a refrain that has been spoken of since the 1800s. It seems like, and if I can judge from the recent debate that took place, the critics, the critical scholars, seem to have all these arguments that never change. They're always the same. And this is perhaps, well, it's certainly one of the oldest arguments that they give, that the two great codexes, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, are the oldest and the best manuscripts. And they say that they're the best. Why? Because they're the oldest. And being the oldest, they're closest to the originals and therefore have the greatest chance of having the fewest corruptions. Well, we're going to see how that is, and I'm going to tell you that that's flat out wrong. I want to read a verse of Scripture to you. We're just going to have one, and it's going to fit in with the entire message. It's from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 13. And it says this, "But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived." Now, we've already talked about words that are deceiving. We've talked about fools and knaves. So I'm just simply going to take it down to where you live. We're going to talk about liars. And we're going to talk about some lies that are told. I'm going to start out by giving you a quote, a couple of quotes, and I'm also going to take a chance on losing you right from the beginning here, but bear with it. I'll bring this down to where you can understand it. The way these guys talk sometimes is so far and above the ordinary man that you can't always get it. The first one is by a fellow named Wilbur Pickering. Now, Wilbur Pickering is actually more on our side than he is on the side of the critical scholars. And he believes what I believe, and that is the true line of manuscripts is called the traditional text or Byzantine text. And he said this, "For someone who claims to be a Christian to exclude the supernatural from his working model is to involve himself in a contradiction. He claims to be a Christian, but he works like an atheist. Anyone who excludes the supernatural from his thinking obviously does not have the Holy Spirit and is therefore wide open to satanic interference in his mind." Now, if you think about it just for a minute, the reason that the critical scholars tell us a series of lies that they never seem to have changed in over a century of searching out new manuscripts and collating manuscripts and just getting flat out headaches from looking at manuscripts, and they never seem to update their lies. It isn't because they know more than you do. It isn't because they've learned more than you do. It's because they have a different heart than you've got. They have a different attitude than you've got. Now, this quote by Pickering was somewhat explained by Edward F. Hills a number of years ago, who wrote a book on the defense of the King James Bible. He said, "After the commencement of the 17th century, rationalists began to arise who laid aside the theological approach to the New Testament text and took up in its stead a naturalistic approach which makes no distinction between the text of the New Testament and that of a purely human book. Denying the common faith, they handled the New Testament text in a wholly secular way. In other words, when they started to look at the New Testament, they started to look at the ancient manuscript evidence, they threw away the idea of God's inspiration of the New Testament. And they threw away any consideration that God preserved the New Testament. And when they looked at the New Testament, they saw it with the same eyes and the same attitude they would have if they were looking at Homer or the Iliad or Plato or Aristotle or any other ancient writing. It's the same thing to them. There's no distinction. And if a person does that, then he not only takes a purely intellectual view, but he shuts himself off from the illumination of the Holy Spirit. He makes himself blind, willfully blind. And that's why Westcott and Hort and some of the old guys in the 1800s came up with all these textual theories and all of these stories that they tell people, and they have had very little change for well over a century. They're still telling the same stories. No matter how often they're refuted, it doesn't make any difference. So we go back to our text. Evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. So we're going to look at a series of lies. But I'm not going to leave you with the lies. We're going to look at some truth too. And we're going to look at some facts. If you really want a solid factual view of manuscript textual history, you're going to get a little bit of that this morning. So, the first great lie is that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are the oldest and best manuscripts. Now, I've already said that. We've heard that probably 50,000 times, if we've heard it one time. But let me remind you of a little bit of background. There are over 6,000, or there are almost 6,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament of various types. Some are written in capital letters, and they all have their special language to describe these things. They call them majuscules, uncials, and some of them have small cursive letters, but you don't want to say lowercase letters like the common man would. You want to say minuscules. And that's not a restaurant menu, but there are thousands of them, so I suppose you could look at them like a menu. But the scholars have divided all of these manuscripts into three basic categories. The first category is the traditional text. They call it usually Byzantine. I like the term traditional because it's the traditional text Bible-believing Christians have held to throughout history. And that comprises about 92% of all of these manuscripts. And then there's the Alexandrian. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are Alexandrian manuscripts. They comprise about 4%. They're considered to be the better manuscripts. And then there is Western and miscellaneous, including some odd duck type of categories, Caesarean, and some they don't even categorize. They don't know what they are. So they throw them around, and they're in this category, Western and miscellaneous, which gives us another 4%. Now, the Textus Receptus is a printed Greek New Testament from which your King James Bible was translated. It was translated from the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus is traditional text. It's in this majority, 92% text. Well, here's another great lie. The Textus Receptus is based on a few late manuscripts. Late meaning they were dated from about the 11th to the 16th centuries. And that's about 1,000 years after the New Testament was inspired. So how in the world could they possibly be accurate? Why, scribes always make mistakes, horrible mistakes. They're always writing these manuscripts by hand. They make mistakes. And I know mistakes are made. I sat down to type out in a book one paragraph. And I think I must have made about 8 or a dozen mistakes. Fortunately, I think I went back and corrected them. But if you ever pick up the book, you'll probably still find one of them there. People make mistakes. Obviously they do. But the idea is that mistakes accumulate themselves over the centuries, and they get worse, and they get worse, and they get worse, and they get worse. Now, never mind the fact that these manuscripts that were used for the Textus Receptus were copied from even older manuscripts, that were copied from even older manuscripts, that were copied from older manuscripts all the way back to the beginning. Never mind that. Never mind the fact that the Christians cared about the accuracy of their Bible. Never mind the fact that they were very careful in their copying. We're going to find out in a few minutes exactly how careful they were. But they were careful. Now, as far as the few manuscripts that were used for the Textus Receptus, that's one of the oldest lies that there is. A man named Erasmus compiled the first edition of the Textus Receptus, and he printed it, and it was printed in 1516. He was a traveler. He had traveled all over Europe. And finally, in 1515, he ended up in Basel, Switzerland. And that's where he printed the first edition. And there were a handful of manuscripts there in Basel, Switzerland, and the scholars act like those handful of manuscripts are the only ones he ever saw. But Erasmus, for well over 10 years, had been traveling in Europe, and he had been scouring universities and monasteries and churches looking for manuscripts. And he had gone from England to Italy to Rome and had access to the Vatican Library, and he even studied some advanced Greek in Italy, and he was all over looking for manuscripts and taking notes and compiling information. He didn't keep them all because he wasn't allowed to, but he saw them and he took notes and he copied things. He had access to a great deal more information than the critical scholars would allow you to believe. They lied to you. And it isn't just that they are determined to be liars, they themselves are deceived. I graduated from Cedarville University How many of you here have ever heard of Cedarville University? Okay. We got a few of you here. It wasn't a university when I graduated, just a college. And it was affiliated with the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches at the time. And the best I can figure out now it's affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention. So you're looking at a man who graduated from an upstanding Southern Baptist college. As if that means a thing. As a matter of fact, I kind of wish it was a little different, but when I was there, not a single professor was a King James or a Textus Receptus man. Now, bear in mind, they all used the King James, most of them, when they preached, because that's how it was in those days. The people in the churches expected that. But when they got in the classroom and they taught you Greek, they used the critical text to teach you Greek. So I was taught Greek using the critical text, but I had a copy of the Textus Receptus. And I still didn't believe it. And they didn't overcome my convictions, because before I went there, I knew where I stood on the Bible. And I've never changed it. So they taught me things that have, in all my studies after that, I've learned were lies. So here's a lie. The Textus Receptus is based on a few late manuscripts. Here's yet another lie. No traditional text manuscript is older than the 5th century, or, as one man said, older than the 4th century. Now, the 4th century is where the critical scholars date Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. I don't believe they're that old. And if you want to know why and more information about that, then go to Brother Sorensen's book tables, and he'll show you what book you ought to get. And go to the KJBRC website and listen to some of Dr. Sorensen's messages on that subject. And you'll find out that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are not very old at all. But the critical scholars have dated them 350 AD. And no traditional text is supposed to be older than that. Well, of course they don't want it to be older, because if it was older, then maybe it would be better, right? Well, there is a manuscript in the 5th century called Alexandrinus, and the Gospel, it's a whole New Testament, and the Gospels are traditional text. And they tell us that the rest of the New Testament is Alexandrian text, dated in the 5th century. Now let's go beyond these lies just for a few minutes before we come back to them and look at a truth. One truth is that the traditional text manuscripts and traditional text readings, that is, words and phrases that are distinctly traditional text, can be traced back to the 2nd century. Now, you scholars out there, bear with me just for a minute, because you can just kind of go back and say, oh, now wait a minute, they're older than that. They're older than 2nd century. We'll get to that, because we're not done yet. But they can be traced easily back to the 2nd century. Beyond that, you have to dig a little. But they're there. Now, I'm going to show you a chart which is, I have to give it to you in 2 parts because it's too big for one slide. But I'm going to show you how the traditional text goes through all the centuries and all the history all the way back to the 2nd century. And we'll start here. Minuscule number 90 is dated 16th century. And since that time, there really hasn't been a whole lot of manuscripts produced, because manuscripts are handwritten. And in the 16th century is when the printing press started printing Greek texts. And then there's minuscule 817, 15th century, and it goes down to minuscule 2814, 12th century, and all the way down at the end to 9th century. And the second chart starts out with a codex in the 8th century and brings it all the way down to Alexandrinus in the 5th century. And notice that the last three on that chart start out with a P. And P stands for papyrus. Now these others are all made probably from parchment. Almost all of them are. But these are made from a real cheap paper that was produced by the papyrus reed that largely grew along the Nile River. It was real cheap. I've read it compared to newspaper print. It goes away quick. It never lasts very long. And one person said that if you had a Bible book like one of Paul's epistles written on papyrus, and you were to take it from church to church to church and read it, it would fall apart and disintegrate by the time you got to the 20th church. It's that flimsy. But there are fragments of these papyrus manuscripts that have been identified, and here are three of them. Papyrus 32, 66, and 52. Now, on each one of these, the scholars have classified these as Alexandrian text, not traditional text. Now, that's very interesting to me because remember the fiat of doctrinal truth among the scholars? No traditional manuscripts before the 4th century. So if you find these things from the 2nd and the 3rd century, they've got to be Alexandrian. Just automatically, they're Alexandrian. But I have examined personally facsimiles of these three papyrus fragments, and they agree not just with the traditional text, they do, but they agree with the Textus Receptus that you have in your library. So, did God preserve His Word? Listen, God isn't going to preserve His Word and leave it lay in a library somewhere. God has preserved His Word, according to Isaiah, for us and for our children forever. Now, let's get another truth. Traditional text manuscripts were present all through history. And, all these manuscripts, thousands of them, were not copied all from one another. They can be proven, many of them, to be independent lines of transmission, and yet largely in agreement with each other, almost entirely in agreement. And they are present, according to the chart I just showed you, every century from the 16th century to the 2nd century. They're present. But yet we've got another lie. We'll look at a lie and a truth here. Here's a lie that's always told. All ancient manuscripts have errors because scribes were careless. All ancient manuscripts, all of them. Now, I've read this, but I've never had somebody come up to me face to face and say all ancient manuscripts have errors. I would like to look at them in the eye and say, have you looked at all the ancient manuscripts? Have you examined all the ancient manuscripts? Do you know anybody who has done that? I don't know of anybody who has done that. There was a man many years ago named von Soden who took traditional text manuscripts and divided them, studied them, divided them into several classes that he called families. So now, traditional text manuscripts are considered to exist in several families. But von Soden only worked with around 400 manuscripts. That's a far cry from how many there are. So no one that I know of and have heard of has ever worked with all of them. And they make this statement, all ancient manuscripts have errors. Well, I've got news for them, and I can make statements too. And I'm going to make one, and that statement is that Christian scribes were exceedingly careful in their copying. Now, to me, that makes perfect sense because if I was going to sit down and do a manuscript of the New Testament, the Word of my God, I would be as careful as possible. Although my eyes may get blurry and I may miss a letter, mistakes occur. But I believe they were very, very careful. But not only that, I believe there's evidence to prove it. Now, what is that evidence? Well, let's go back to Wilbur Pickering just for a moment. Now, Wilbur Pickering is a man who graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary, and he wrote his master's thesis there, and he wrote and published a book in the 1970s called The Identity of the New Testament Text, where he tried and sought to prove that the traditional text was the New Testament text. And he's never changed that. Never changed that. But he went off to Brazil and became a Bible translator in Brazil. And then he started, later on in life, he started working with one of those traditional text families. Von Soden called it KR, but Pickering calls it Family 35. And that's kind of gotten some traction, that name. And it's about perhaps 300 or 400 manuscripts that are in that family. Now, Pickering hasn't looked at all of them, and he hasn't examined them all. But in one case, he examined 37 manuscripts of the book of Romans. And out of those 37 manuscripts, he found 18 of those manuscripts only made one mistake in copying for an average of every 4 chapters. One mistake for an average of 4 chapters. 9 of those manuscripts had one mistake for every 2 chapters. 8 of them, one mistake per chapter. 2 of them, 2 mistakes per chapter. Now let's compare this for a moment to Vaticanus, that revered, almost worshipped manuscript. Let's compare that for one chapter in the book of Mark, chapter 1. Vaticanus has more than 30 mistakes in one chapter. And Sinaiticus is similar. Now, how is that for comparison. But when you look at this kind of a comparison in the Family 35, that's excellent. But just for a minute, let's take those 18 manuscripts that only had one mistake for every 4 chapters. And let's look at them a little bit closer. 3 of those manuscripts, 3 of them had 0 mistakes in the entire book. 0 mistakes. And 2 of them had 1 mistake for the whole book. 3 of them had 2 mistakes for the whole book. 5 of them had 3 mistakes for the whole book. And 5 more had 4 mistakes in the entire book of Romans. That is exceedingly careful copying. Exceedingly careful copying. And by the way, Wilbur Pickering has a book called God Has Preserved His Text. And he explains what a lot of these mistakes are. The scribe corrected a lot of the mistakes, and some of them were just clear and obvious foolish mistakes and errors. Just clear and obvious. And even for those that were serious mistakes, the rest of the manuscripts showed you what the right reading was. It was very clear. Well, we can't stop. We can't stop. Let's go with one more lie and one more truth. One more lie. No New Testament book could possibly have been in Palestine by the mid-1st century. As a matter of fact, the critical scholars really don't want to admit that the New Testament books were written in the 1st century at all. They want to believe that they were written later. Paul's epistles were written by a liar who called himself Paul. How you like that? You sit down and read the book of Romans where salvation is explained from beginning to end, and it was written by a liar who called himself Paul? How can you trust anything it says? How can the world trust anything? Is it any wonder that our world has gone into pagan nonsense and madness? There is no Bible to hold them back. It doesn't exist anymore. The scholars want to get complete rid of it. But they don't want to be obvious about it because they want to keep their personal income for being a scholar. Hey, I'm an intellectual. I'm a scholar. I will teach your children in college that they have no Bible that they can trust. Well, I believe the truth is that some of the New Testament books were actually written in Palestine, like the Gospel of Mark. Some of them were written in the early, the mid to early and a little bit later in the 1st century, and getting to Palestine would have been no trick at all. Well, they did. They made it. And you don't have to believe that because I tell you. You have to believe that at all because I say it. Let me show it to you. And before I do, I'll give you a little bit of background. You've all heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, they were discovered around 1947, and they were taken, the Dead Sea Scrolls were a bunch of scrolls and fragments that were taken out of a series of 12 caves on the northern end of the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956. And there was one cave that was researched in 1955. It was cave 7. And what they found there was astounding. Absolutely astounding. They don't believe it, but it's astounding. They brought out a series of 18 papyrus fragments. And some of them were in a couple, 2 or 3 different pieces. But they brought them out, and there was a 19th fragment which they couldn't bring out because it had dissolved away completely. Well, then how did they know about it? Well, strangely enough, everything had dissolved away except the ink. And the ink was embedded in hardened mud and could be read. So they photographed it. So there were 19. Some of them were unidentifiable. They were just too small and too damaged. A few of them. That was about, say, 6 or 7 of them. And the first 2 were found to be from the book of Exodus and from an apocryphal writing called the letter of Jeremiah. That's what they determined. But there were a whole series of them that they couldn't identify. They didn't know what they were. So they called in one of the leading, most respected and renowned papyrologists in the entire world, a man named Jose O'Callaghan. And they brought him in to Israel, and all these fragments at the time were in the Rockefeller Museum, and they let him examine those fragments. And he took some of it to the Israeli police lab to be examined. And he expected, right along with everybody else, that they were going to find Old Testament or Old Testament Apocrypha on all of them. Well, that would have been wonderful. He would have been hailed as a great hero had that been the case. Well, the first thing they knew, of course, is that none of these fragments could be any later than 68 AD. When John and some of the apostles were still living. And so O'Callaghan examined them. And he was astounded because they were not Old Testament. They were New Testament. And here's a list of them. There are 9 of them, and they're several from the book of Mark, book of Acts, James, Romans, 2 Peter, 1 Timothy. And O'Callaghan identified them, and suddenly the most renowned papyrologist in the world was ostracized. And he was hated, and it was denied. Every textual scholar, every New Testament scholar, they all said, no, this couldn't possibly be. And why couldn't it be? Because their preconceived beliefs were that no New Testament writing could be in Palestine that early. And they weren't willing to give up their religious, doctrinal bias. But O'Callaghan stood where he stood, and he stood on this, and for years he fought the battle. And then another well-known, renowned papyrologist, Peter Karsten Thiede, stepped in and backed him. And other papyrologists said, hey, he's right. But the scholarly, critical world still denies it. So, when O'Callaghan looked at this, he had one problem. He compared the writing with the standard Greek New Testament text. And the standard Greek New Testament text to him was the Nestle-Aland text. And Karsten Thiede took the Nestle-Aland text too. So when they looked at these things, they looked at one which is designated 7Q5. That's Mark chapter 6, verses 52 to 53. And they decided that it was a perfect match for Mark 6. And papyrologists have a little technique they use, and I'm not going to try to explain it to you, but it's called stichometry. And it's where they take their standard text and the papyri, and they estimate how many letters per line were originally on the papyrus. And if they can do that and take the text from their standard text and lay it over the papyri, and these letters that are on the papyrus all line up the way they're supposed to, then it's evidence that they're right. Well, they got a pretty good result taking the Nestle text. But in order to do that, they had to remove 3 words out of the Nestle text because they didn't fit. Well, I looked at that, and I looked at O'Callaghan's stichometry, and I said, well, what if we take the Textus Receptus and leave those 3 words in? Because everything has those 3 words. Vaticanus has them, Nestle has them, UBS has them, the Textus Receptus has them. And although it's possible the scribe may have left them out, it's possible, what happens if you leave them in? So I reworked the stichometry and left the words in. And it is a perfect match to the Textus Receptus. Except for one thing. The words are there, but they're misplaced. The key word that identified this was the word Gennesaret. And in the Textus Receptus, those 3 words are before Gennesaret. In the stichometry, you have to put them after Gennesaret. But that also is a typical mistake of scribes when they handwrite a text. The words are an exact match to the Textus Receptus. So tell me, what is the oldest and the best manuscripts? Is it Vaticanus? I like that question that was asked. It's older and better. Why is it better? And nobody can really answer that question. But I say the traditional text is the oldest and best manuscripts. And why are they the best? I think I've showed you. Listen, the King James Bible is a 100% accurate and complete translation of the traditional Textus Receptus. The King James Bible is the Word of God in English, without error. And if I might overstep my bounds just one little tiny bit, here's the line and I'll step over it with a toe. The King James Bible is perfect. Now the reason I say perfect is because the definition of perfect is accurate and complete. It's not some mystical thing that nobody can understand. It means accurate and complete. And when you read the King James Bible, you are reading the words God gave us in English.